It's called being a non-anxious presence. It doesn't mean that you're in control of every situation, but it means that you have the ability to keep your head, what the old poet Rudyard Kipling meant by, if you can keep your head about you when all around are losing theirs and blaming it on you. And that's what Jesus does, even in the last days of his life, when it feels like everything else is spinning out of control, even when his own inner circle of disciples is getting ready to betray or abandon him. Jesus remains a non-anxious presence, bringing peace into the midst of the chaos of Holy Week. That's what we're going to be exploring this time on Meeting Jesus. As we finally make the turn into Mark chapter 14, we're sort of seeing a lot of things come to a culmination point in Mark's gospel. We've been seeing throughout all these weeks, all these chapters, the story of how Jesus enters onto the scene and surprises people. He brings healing and compassion to outcasts. He speaks in ways that upset the powerful, respectable people. He's constantly leaving his disciples confused and befuddled, and yet he's patient with them. And now as we turn into chapter 14, the tensions are simmering, getting to a boiling point all around him. And yet Jesus has a way of both keeping his cool and keeping his eye on people who would otherwise be ignored. Here's what I mean. The beginning of Mark chapter 14 gives this ominous warning. It's 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. And we who know the story of Jesus know that that means we are really, really close to Jesus' last night with his disciples. And on that day, the respectable religious leaders, the priests and the scribes, are now openly conspiring to look for a way to arrest Jesus secretly so that they can get rid of him, because they say they're afraid of it happening during the festival itself. They don't want a riot to break out. So clearly the powerful people, the respectable religious people, see Jesus as public enemy number one. They don't want a riot to break out that would mean that the Romans then come in and bring the hammer down and do all sorts of destruction. They're looking for ways to get rid of Jesus. And then we get this surprising scene, knowing all that danger in the background, and Jesus is out in the suburbs of Jerusalem, in Bethany, in a village outside of the city. He happens to be at a dinner hosted by a man named Simon the leper. I'm gonna guess he's over his leprosy at this point. But he's at a dinner, and as he's sitting at the table, this woman comes up, an unidentified, unnamed woman comes up with this jar, this alabaster jar with very, very expensive ointment. And she takes the jar, breaks it open, and pours the ointment on Jesus' head. And some around are looking at this show of just overwhelming extravagance and generosity for Jesus, tenderness and intimacy, and they all get upset. The text says, some were saying, why was this ointment wasted in this way? This ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. That's almost like 9 months of salary if you work minimum wage, average daily wage in the first century. And the money could have been given to the poor, they insist. And they scold this poor woman. And Jesus looks at her and honors her and says, look, you know I care about the poor, and it's great. Anytime we want, we could be taking care of the poor here. But you don't always have me. And she knows it somehow. Jesus identifies that this action is really like anointing Jesus' own body for its burial. Jesus is not only aware that his death is on the horizon, but is headed toward it peacefully, without nervousness, without fear, without anxiety, without looking for a way out. And instead, he uses this moment to try and protect and honor and respect this unnamed woman who's come to show a kindness to him. Jesus receives this as an act of genuine care and compassion and love being shown to him. And instead of being all upset that she's done this thing, Jesus welcomes it. And in fact, Jesus says something really, really surprising and beautiful. Jesus says, she's done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Those words are powerful because you and I probably know that it's just another couple of paragraphs, and Jesus takes the bread that we call the institution of the Lord's Supper, that becomes the foundation of Holy Communion, and takes the bread and blesses the bread and says, "Do this in remembrance of me," right? And we Christians, of course, we should center on Jesus, and we should do things in memory of Jesus, because Jesus is the center of our faith story. And here Jesus has stopped and turned the limelight on this unnamed woman, saying she's done something really beautiful for me, and I don't want her contribution to be forgotten. Here are the other disciples who are all embarrassed by what she's done, are looking to erase her from the story. They want to actually erase her from the memory of this moment. We don't want her and her act of generosity here. It sort of shows us up, and it seems uncouth. And Jesus instead says she's done something beautiful. She has some awareness of where my story is going to take me, and she's giving her expression of love and her farewell to me, anointing my body beforehand for burial. And so Jesus says what she's done will be remembered and told wherever the good news is told, in remembrance of her. And here we are 2,000 years later, and we don't even know her name or what the perfume, what the ointment smelled like, but her action, here it is. We've held on to it. We're retelling in remembrance of what she's done for Jesus. Jesus has a way of doing that, of seeing people that other people overlook or intentionally want to ignore, and lifting them up and honoring them. Not just simply treating them like recipients of his pity, but showing their dignity and appreciating their contributions. That's beautiful. And that Jesus does this days before his own arrest and crucifixion is amazing to me. I get nervous before a doctor's appointment, and I get short-tempered. I get nervous and kind of cranky before a big meeting or something that's making me nervous about the future. And here Jesus, staring down his own death, still has this sense of calm and being in control and isn't shaken. He's a non-anxious presence. After that, Mark tells us that one of Jesus' disciples, Judas Iscariot, decides he's willing to betray Jesus and simply makes quiet arrangements with the chief priest that he'll betray Jesus for money, and then he starts looking for when his opportunity is. And I don't want to speculate a whole lot about what's going on in Judas's heart. Plenty of storytellers, movie makers, and preachers have tried to psychoanalyze what's going on in Judas's mind, sometimes making him out to be like a terrible mustache-twirling villain who now hates Jesus. Others who are convinced that maybe he doesn't really understand what he's doing, or that he wants to back out once he realizes. Others who think that maybe Judas is trying to force Jesus' hand, that he's still convinced that Jesus could be the one who could overthrow the Romans if he just strikes at the right moment and tells people it's time to join the movement and grab your pitchforks and your weapons, and is now disappointed that Jesus has missed that opportunity, that Jesus doesn't seem interested at all in raising up a militia or fighting off the Romans or taking his country back for God. This is not what Jesus has come for. And some have suggested this is Judas' attempt sort of to try and force Jesus' hand. Maybe if I push Jesus into a corner, he'll finally do what I want him to do. And again, that's still betrayal. I can't guess at what's going on in Judas's mind, other than he's finally convinced himself that Jesus isn't who he thought he was, and he would rather get rid of Jesus and be done with this whole scene. From there, Mark turns the story to getting ready for the Passover festival itself. Passover, of course, is the central festival and story and holiday in ancient Judaism. It tells the story again of their liberation from enslavement in Egypt, and the story of God's miraculous provision and how they got out through the Red Sea. All those memories are part of this annual celebration. So in a sense, it's like both religious holiday like Easter and national holiday like Independence Day and Thanksgiving all rolled into one. And Jesus gathers not his biological family really, but his found family, this community of disciples who've come with him into the city, and he gets their help to help prepare. He sends some of them into town. He says, you're going to run across a guy who's carrying a jar of water. You ask him about the upper room that I can eat the Passover with my disciples in. Jesus clearly has been making arrangements, making friends, even building relationships when his disciples weren't paying attention. That may be a helpful reminder for us too, we modern day disciples of Jesus, that Jesus reserves the right to be at work and to be making connections and laying groundwork for things Jesus is up to without consulting us first, without our permission even. But from there, once the preparations are ready, Jesus is sitting eating the Passover dinner with his disciples, and he just lays it out with them. I know one of you is going to betray me. And of course, everybody is convinced, no, surely that's not me. It's not me. And the most Jesus will say, it's one of you 12, one who's dipping bread into the bowl with me. But the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that one not to have been born. There's something vulnerable about Jesus in that he's willing to risk knowing he's going to be betrayed, knowing that one of his own is going to be the one who turns him in. And Jesus doesn't resist it or try and out-strategize. Okay, I'm headed into this. Jesus knows he's headed toward a cross. He's been telling his disciples for chapters now that he's headed toward a cross, that he'll be rejected by the powerful and the religious, that he'll be crucified, and he's insisted then he'll rise on the third day. That doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for the choice to betray Jesus. It doesn't mean that in the end, Judas's betrayal gets the last word. It doesn't. So Jesus holds together the sense of he's vulnerable enough, he's willing to risk being betrayed by one of his own disciples. He's willing to stare down going into a cross and going to death. And at the same time, those who ally themselves against Jesus won't get the last word. Somehow that's where all of our lives of faith are lived. We're called to be people who are vulnerable, people who are willing to risk being rejected, who are willing to risk mistreatment by the rest of the world, and yet we're confident that in the end God's reign wins, that justice is done, and that God's goodness is vindicated in the end. How that works out in the end, what exactly that will mean, that's hard for us to know. And to be honest, most of the time in our lives, we live in that tension, waiting to see how God puts things right, and we're not there yet, but also called like Jesus to risk being vulnerable in a world full of mean. It's hard sometimes living in that space. And whatever else the crucifixion and the passion of Jesus mean, I do think it is important to notice the way Mark tells the story, that Jesus navigates all these things without losing his cool. Not that he doesn't care, not that he's apathetic, but more like Jesus can be that non-anxious presence even when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Sometimes I think that's by itself our calling as Christians, to be that presence embodying peace even when it feels like everything else is in upheaval and turmoil. That's hard. That's why we do this together. But that too is a part of what it is to follow Jesus and to get to know him. Those are the stories we're going to be taking a look at this coming Thursday. Join us every Thursday, as we've been doing all throughout 2024, getting to know Jesus through Mark's Gospel. And we hope you'll join us, whether in person or in these video summary sessions. See you next time.